When Donald Trump was sworn back in as US president in January, he declared that he would deliver the most extraordinary first 100 days of any presidency in American history. 100 or so days later, there is a case that he has delivered on this promise, though extraordinary is one of those adjectives which is very much in the eye of the beholder. The first moon landing was extraordinary, so was the wreck of the Hindenburg. The following are all things which have, during President Trump's second first 100 days, happened. More than 1,500 people convicted for their participation in an attempt to overturn a US presidential election have been pardoned. Tariffs have been imposed on islands inhabited more or less exclusively by penguins. A sweeping regime of arbitrary deportation has been established, whose victims so far include a 4-year-old US citizen undergoing treatment for cancer and a Salvadoran man whom the administration admitted was delivered to a foreign prison in error, but has refused to retrieve despite the instructions of courts, a position justified by the president brandishing a clearly photoshopped image of gang tattoos. The president of a European nation fighting Russia for its survival has been publicly berated in the Oval Office. Threats have been made to invade or annex the territory of 2 NATO allies. Tens of thousands of American public servants have been fired in a cost-cutting crusade overseen by an unelected foreign-born billionaire. Foreign aid and scientific research programs have been gutted. This is a necessarily incomplete summary. One of the many difficulties with holding Trump to any kind of account is that it's tough to keep up. It cannot be argued this time that the American people did not know what and who they were voting for, although Trump 100 days in is posting the second worst approval ratings of any president in US history at this stage of their term, undercut only by Trump himself during his first term. Is there method to all this apparent madness? Could any of this mayhem be said to be doing any good? And what should we expect from the next 1,360 days? This is the Foreign Desk.
The legislative branch here has just rolled over and is playing dead.
Take him seriously about Greenland. When a president stands in front of Congress and says, I will do this, well, here in America, we call that policy.
Every day you wake up and you wonder what will be destroyed today.
You're listening to The Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Muller. My first guest is Claire Jones, US economics editor at the Financial Times. Claire joins us from Washington, D.C. Claire, if we're going to talk about economics, we should obviously talk about tariffs. They have been one of very few constants of Donald Trump's worldview going back for decades before he even went into politics. He loves tariffs. Is it any clearer to you now than it was perhaps 100 days ago why they excite him so much?
I think that's a really, really good question. I mean, as you say, there's been this long-held view that he's had that tariffs are the way to go for the US economy, that they need to bring US manufacturing jobs back, and especially insulate the US economy from China. I think what's caught everyone by surprise, I think there's 2 elements of it. I mean, if we hark back to when he actually came into office, the economic sentiment on Trump was very good. You know, people at Davos, that kind of crowd, were very buoyed by the idea that he'd cut taxes, that he'd, deregulate the economy. And they knew he was a fan of tariffs. But I don't think 100 days ago, a lot of people realized to what degree he was a fan of tariffs. And I think the measures that we saw on April the 2nd, the so-called Liberation Day, gave us a lot of insight into the kind of fuzziness of how they've really been designing economic policy. One thing that really caught people by surprise was that the tariffs were so high. The other thing I think that caught people by surprise was that they were backed by this equation that didn't really make any sense to any trade economists that you talk to. And I think that sheer unpredictability of, not only backing a policy that was set to kind of like reverse the course of a global economy in a way that we haven't seen for like 80 years or even a century in some people's minds, but to do so on the basis of a method that few people really understood. I think that really, really spooked people.
Well, I mean, the markets initially, at least, clearly didn't understand where Trump thought he was going with this. They tanked somewhat spectacularly. There's been a slight recovery since, and Trump's line has been that, the bounteous effects of these tariffs will, of course, take time to become manifest. But as anybody else other than the president understands it, is there the faintest chance that if they stay the course with these tariffs, they will bring about what he is promising, i.e. a return to the United States of its manufacturing sector, most prominent among them?
I think not in the short term, at least. I mean, I think we still have a lot of uncertainty about what these trade deals are actually going to look like. If you speak to people on the US side, they say, they're close to inking some deals with the likes of India and some other Asian economies, but that doesn't seem to have been the case so far. So I think one element of judging whether or not it's going to bring manufacturing jobs back is, just to understand what the deals are going to look like. And at the moment, because people don't know what the deals are going to look like, no business is going to invest in the US. So it's not going to bring back jobs immediately because it's going to put all of these businesses on pause. No one's going to make investment plans. No one's going to build a factory when economic policy making is so unpredictable. So in the short term, no one's going to be doing anything because we don't know what these trade deals are going to look like. Beyond that, it really depends. I mean, we talked to Janet Yellen, the former US Treasury Secretary, earlier this week. And, she made the point that a lot of the spirit of this is about bringing back jobs that the US lost when China joined the World Trade Organization at the turn of the century. Now, as she pointed out, the issue is a lot of the jobs that the US under Biden was trying to create in sectors such as green tech rely on raw materials from China. So without those critical minerals, for instance, coming in from China, you can't really make batteries in the US. So some of these manufacturing jobs Trump's trying to bring back, they depend on industrial inputs that the US just can't magic up on its own soil. So there's also a risk there that because you're unwinding the supply chains, the manufacturers are not going to have the raw inputs that they need to actually produce the finished goods. There's also other impacts that, if you're looking at the cost of producing some of these products in the US, it's just going to be too high. So in the short term, I mean, it might work a little bit, but in the short term, there's lots of things to suggest it's not going to have an immediate impact in bringing jobs back.
I mean, there have been a lot of suggestions, as you'll be aware, that we haven't really begun to notice the full impact of the tariffs on the United States. You'll be familiar with the reports of massive drop-offs in ships arriving at at American ports, or setting sail for American ports. Reports of significant drop-offs in tourist numbers. But outside MAGA world, are there anybody, or is there anybody in the economic sphere who actually does see some sort of way forward here, who does actually think this could work?
On the level that Trump wants it to work, and to the extent that he's talking about raising tariffs to levels not seen in more than a century, I don't think people think that can work. I think where the sort of the mainstream thinks elements of it can work is, the traditional kind of like Reaganite Republican is a fan of tax cuts and deregulation. And that is a big element of what Trump's talked about too. But on the tariffs, I mean, even from his own economic advisors, they've been quite critical. And we've seen a bit of wrestling even within his actual administration about, people such as Scott Bessent, who don't want them to be quite as drastic as maybe the president or people like Peter Navarro would like.
Claire Jones, Financial Times US economics editor in Washington, D.C. Thank you for joining us. You're listening to The Foreign Desk. You're listening to The Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Muller. Universities have been a frequent recipient of Trump's ire, damned as nests of subversives fixated on such treacherous notions as facts and thought. My next guest is Dr. Catherine Hayhoe, the Chief Scientist for the Nature Conservancy and Professor and Chair in Public Policy and Public Law in the Department of Political Science at Texas Tech University. Catherine, is there a simple way you can sum up what it has been like these last 100 days being an academic and a scientist in the United States?
Every day you wake up and you wonder what will be destroyed today.
Wow. It's really that grim?
It really is. So some days it might be something that matters to you, but is not directly connected to you personally. And other days, like just the other day, it's deeply personal, such as all of the hundreds of authors for the upcoming National Climate Assessment, which I served as a lead author for 3 times, being summarily dismissed.
I mean, with a specific example like that you know well, what kind of real-world impact can that end up having further down the track?
Well, there's something that I see most of these changes having in common, and that is it will make life more difficult and or more expensive and definitely more risky and even more dangerous for the average person. So whether it's the changes in food safety standards or whether it's the fact that we will no longer have the latest information on how quickly climate is changing and how it's affecting every aspect of society and lives, all of those put people at risk.
What kind of conversations are you hearing among your fellow academics, though? Is there a lot of talk about just giving up for at least as long as this lasts and going somewhere else?
So every day I hear from one colleague or another that their grant was canceled, their students have to be let go, their own position, if they work for the federal government or on a federal grant, has been terminated, or they expect it will be terminated any day and they're actively seeking other employment. Last week, I was speaking at a conference, and the woman who got up on stage right after me to give her talk next opened her talk by sharing that she had just heard that morning that her big grant that supported all of her wonderful graduate students who were sitting right there beside her had just been terminated that morning. And there she was speaking at the conference. So there's a tremendous sense of loss, of grief for having to abandon research that is halfway through that could actually make a difference in people's lives, for not being able to support students because graduate students are typically supported by research in the sciences. And surveys have been showing that an increasing number of scientists in the United States are looking elsewhere for jobs outside the US, and the number of scientists looking for jobs inside the US has similarly dropped precipitously.
I mean, do you get any sense, though, what these reforms, if that's what we're going to call them, are actually intended to accomplish? Because you don't often get a government just boldly going out and saying, vote for us, we're just going to wreck everything for the heck of it. Has there been communicated to you at least any even spurious and superficial rationale for how or why this is supposed to make things better?
Well, if you read the executive orders, just about every executive order has in it the rationale for what they are doing. And so, for example, the rationale to shut down one of the premier climate modeling institutes in the country, which was hosted by Princeton University through the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. This is the climate modeling lab where the scientists won the Nobel Prize in physics just a few years ago for their cutting edge research into climate science. This is the lab that looks at how climate extremes are changing. The US now gets $1 billion weather and climate disaster on average every 2 weeks, whereas back in the 1980s, there was only 3 a year. So shutting down this lab, the rationale given in the executive order was that studying climate change promotes climate anxiety. And so to prevent climate anxiety, they would prefer that nobody study this. So that was the rationale, just as one example given in one executive order.
So we're not going to pay people to tell us things we don't want to hear. Is it difficult for universities to judge whether or not they do stand up to this administration? We've seen some do it, Harvard perhaps most notably, at the possible cost of $2 billion in federal funding, although Harvard can probably afford it better than most. But this is a difficult decision for any institution of higher learning to have to make, because presumably the fear is if you take the administration on, they'll just make it even worse.
That's exactly the case. It's a cost-benefit analysis for each university. Now, there are about 200 universities who have signed a letter together stating that they stand with Harvard. But the challenge that we have, especially in the health sciences and the other sciences, is that a lot of the research at universities is at least partially supported by federal funds. And so even apart from the situation where the government wants to have an ideological influence on the university, even apart from that, they're making changes across the board in the overhead rates that are allowed on any grants. And the overhead rates pay for things like the labs and the electricity and the internet and computer servers and basic things. And the university most don't have the resources to nickel and dime the accounting to actually get the money back that they need to support that research. And so just cutting what we call the facilities and administrative costs, or the overhead costs that are allowable on grants, which are typically about 50% at most institutions, cutting that down to 10% makes it prohibitive to do research with grants from those federal agencies anywhere.
Well, finally, and possibly terrifyingly then, and to remind ourselves and our listeners that it has only been 100 days, is it imaginable what another 4 years less 100 days of this sort of onslaught could have on America's education sector?
I think that if this continues or even maintains at the current status, there will be a large-scale brain drain. Students will be de-incentivized from applying to graduate programs in the U.S. because the funding sources will be uncertain. If they go ahead with cutting half of NASA's science budget, for example, what does that do for space science in the United States? Faculty members will be actively looking for positions elsewhere, and many students will be discouraged from going into STEM fields because they don't see a future for themselves in that area. And so you talked earlier about when will the impacts be seen? These impacts will have a tail of years and even decades.
That was Dr. Catherine Hayhoe, Chief Scientist for the Nature Conservancy and a professor at Texas Tech University. This is The Foreign Desk. This is The Foreign Desk on Monocle Radio. Hostility to immigration was a motif of Trump's first term. It has been ramped up considerably in the first 100 days of his second. Well, joining me now is Hamed Ali Aziz, reporter for The New York Times, covering the Department of Homeland Security and immigration policy. Hamed, I guess the obvious place to come in is to ask whether what Trump has done in office is really any more or less than what he said he was going to do.
Yeah, well, on the immigration front, when it comes to deportations, there haven't been mass deportations where millions of people have been rounded up and deported, or even the administration being on track to get to those numbers. But the president has tried many things to start that process. They've tried to deport people under a wartime law that doesn't allow for due process for immigrants, to deport people to a prison in El Salvador. They've effectively shut down the border. They've targeted college students who had green cards and visas. They've allowed ICE to target any undocumented immigrant across the United States. So they've taken a lot of efforts to try to get to that point, but at this point, it's a slow-moving train.
Do you get the sense, though, that what they're doing so far, and some of those maneuvers you laid out there are different to Trump's first term, that they're trying to figure out what people will tolerate? Because Biden, for all that Trump keeps belting him for allowing illegal immigration to get out of control, did deport nearly 4.5 million people, which is actually 1.5 million people more than Trump deported during his first term. So do you get the sense that this is just the beginning, that they are trying to see how far they can go and how quickly?
Definitely. One thing to put into context with those Biden numbers is that a lot of those numbers were of people who were deported from the border.
Hmm.
And when you have the numbers so high at the southern border as they were during the Biden administration, that will bring up the overall deportation numbers. One of the things that the Trump administration is trying to do is trying to ramp up deportations of people who are within the United States. And that is really difficult. It takes a long time for ICE officers to find undocumented immigrants, to locate them, to surveil them, and to even arrest them. The officers, the immigration officers in the United States, are not able to just open somebody's door, to kick down a door. They have to have the immigrant voluntarily open the door or be outside in the public to pick them up. So it takes a lot of manpower and a lot of resources. And that's something that the administration is coming up against right now.
But what do you think the administration will have gleaned, though, in terms of what the public will be able to tolerate? Because there have been, obviously, several fairly outrageous examples of the kind of thing we're talking about. Somebody deported to Nayib Bukele's Salvadoran mega prison in a deportation even the administration has admitted was a mistake. But they've nevertheless said, we're not bringing him back and we're not even going to try, however many judges tell us we have to. There have been US citizens, and in fact, indeed, extremely ill child US citizens deported. Will they glean from that and the fact that, there's been some outrage, but not overwhelming outrage, that they do have a license to continue?
Yeah, this administration, they came in with feeling like they had a mandate on immigration because of the American public, the polling indicating that Americans were fed up with the Biden administration's immigration strategy, with the record numbers at the southern border, and that a change was needed. So as opposed to the first go around, this time the administration felt like the American public was behind them on immigration, on an immigration crackdown. But you've seen already, like you mentioned, particularly the case of the individual who was deported to El Salvador, that Americans are a little bit uneasy about removing people without due process, just because due process is such a part of the American fabric, this idea that everybody has a chance to make their case in court. And in this situation, it felt like for a lot of people that didn't happen and that an error was made, like you said, that the government, willingly stated. But I don't see this administration backing down. And I don't see the same type of protest activity that we saw during the first Trump administration, where there was as we remember, a Muslim ban, where many hundreds, thousands of protesters showed up at airports. That hasn't happened this go around, where protesters are taking to the street specifically talking about the immigration crackdown. So I think that this administration will continue moving forward on their strategies.
So just finally then, do you think the likelihood is that this really is just the beginning, that what Donald Trump, and I guess in particular his particular ideological homunculus on this issue, Stephen Miller, have said, that this really is just the beginning?
Definitely. I think so. We're only 3.5 months in. We should expect them to continue the crackdown, to try to get every part of the U.S. immigration law and use it to their advantage to deport as many people as possible. This is one of their main policies. This is something that they feel like, again, they have a mandate to do, and that it's something that they need to carry out because they promised it to voters during the campaign. So we should expect much more.
Hamed Ali Aziz, immigration reporter for the New York Times. Thank you for joining us. This is The Foreign Desk. This is the Foreign Desk on Monocle Radio. If Congress has so far displayed little inclination to impede Trump's agenda, American courts have proved a little more robust. In the last 100 days, at least 132 lawsuits have won reversals or pauses of the administration's actions. Well, joining me now is Jamie Floyd, attorney, journalist and former White House fellow during the Clinton administration. Jamie, first of all, at Trump's big triumphant rally celebrating his first 100 days in Michigan earlier this week, he went off again about, as he put it, communist radical left judges, which I'm pretty sure is an inaccurate characterization of the outlook of most of America's judiciary. So where do you think he's actually going with this?
Right. Well, Donald Trump's reference, and by the way, it's not just Trump. His top level advisors, including Stephen Miller, who's one of the architects of his strategy and policy, going back to the first Trump administration, and others, Steve Bannon, they're all using this language. But these references to communists, radical leftist judges, hearkening back to sort of McCarthyism from the 1950s. It's part of, in my view, a broader rhetorical strategy. And it does three things. It discredits the judiciary. So, it gets ahead of judicial decisions against him. It also rallies his political base. And third, it continues to position Trump as a victim of our judicial system. So that's what he's trying to do there.
But 100 days in, do you get the sense that the judiciary is at least doing a better job of being a check and or balance on the executive than the legislative branch, which so far just seems to be absolutely terrified of him?
No doubt about it. And that is precisely the right question. I mean, the legislative branch here has just rolled over and is playing dead. And the judiciary, to the extent it can, has taken significant steps to try and keep Donald Trump and the Trump administration in check with rulings and injunctions and indictments, as we've seen in the past, and now efforts to uphold the rule of law in this current administration. They're blocking his attempt to end what we call birthright citizenship. So if you're born here, you are a citizen of this country. And Trump has tried to end that in his last administration. And here, it's in our Constitution. You can't just do away with it. He's tried to end funding for sanctuary cities that give sanctuary to people who are under threat of deportation. He has been deporting, as I'm sure you've been following closely, scores and scores and scores of people. And the courts have stepped in, including the Supreme Court, ordering the return of one man, Kilmar Abrego Garcia. And he's just ignoring that. But the court is pushing back. And then there are the workplace firings, hundreds and hundreds of people that he's tried to let go. And the courts have said, no, you have to bring those people back. So overall, it's a pushback against his broad exercise of executive power, which he believes, we have this theory called the unitary executive theory, which posits that the president and the executive has more power than the other two branches. And the courts are pushing back. And without a doubt, the legislature is not.
The courts are pushing back, but so far at least, President Trump is not really responding to their instructions as someone in his position is supposed to, at least as I understand it. What is actually supposed to happen when you get to the point, and it does appear that this is something he is willing to countenance, where a president is given a clear instruction by a court, perhaps even by the Supreme Court, and simply refuses to obey it? What is supposed to happen in that circumstance?
Right. Well, therein lies the rub. It's a very, very dangerous course we're on, because we don't have any system other than mutual respect amongst the three branches of government. That is really the way it works. The courts have no power to enforce their rulings. The law enforcement agencies technically follow the president, and Congress especially this one, which is essentially controlled by this president, if it rolls over and refuses to act because it's in league with the president, that's the best check we've got against the president. So our system is really very much about norms as much as it is about rules and about laws. And so if the president acts as though he's above the law, the system begins to collapse. Now, we have had some presidents before who've done this kind of thing. Andrew Jackson, who famously is President Trump's favorite president, or one of his favorites. Richard Nixon tried to defy the law. He did eventually capitulate and do as he was asked and told. Andrew Johnson, who was impeached famously in our past, our distant past, but it's a very rare thing. And we are tumbling toward what the phrase we're all hearing so frequently over the last 100 days, the dreaded constitutional crisis.
I mean, to the extent, though, that we can ascribe any coherent strategic thinking to what Trump's approach to the judicial system is. You spoke there about norms. Is he essentially trying to create new norms, a new idea of what the judiciary should be, i.e. something that is much less robust and much less independent? And he does, of course, have that Supreme Court ruling in his pocket, which does, in fact, kind of suggest that the president is literally above the law for as long as they hold the office.
Right. And that goes back to this unitary executive theory that I was speaking of earlier, and I absolutely think you're right. I think there are strong signs that is exactly what President Trump is trying to do. He's intentionally pushing the limits of executive power. This isn't just Trump being legally defiant, being spoiled, throwing a tantrum. This is strategic, in my view. He is in open defiance of the courts. He is attacking judges and prosecutors, but he's framing the legal system as corrupt and weaponized, not just as legal pushback, but as a deliberate attempt to delegitimize that third branch of government. And if you go all the way back to the very founding of our country, it took us a while to figure out that balance of power. And it took our not first Chief Justice, but John Marshall, who came along in the 1820s and 30s, who really developed the robust third branch of government that we know today, that Andrew Jackson fought back against and actually defied. He said, go pound sand. I'm not doing what you tell me to do. And so Donald Trump is trying to go back to that very strong, powerful, centralized executive that would have more power than in our system the executive is supposed to have.
That was Jamie Floyd, attorney and journalist. Thank you for joining us. This is The Foreign Desk. This is The Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Muller. Joining me finally is Tom Nichols, staff writer at The Atlantic. Tom, we're talking in the week that the much-vaunted minerals deal with Ukraine has been signed. Can we at least credit that as a foreign policy win from the first 100 days?
I wouldn't. I think that shaking down a friend and ally while they're fighting for their lives against a Russian invasion is embarrassing. And I think it's indicative of this administration's belief that unless you can put some sort of coin in your pocket, that your relationships don't really matter. I mean, it really shows the transactionality of the Trump administration. And I think it's not something as an American I would point to with pride personally.
I mean, it's not like American administrations in the past haven't approached diplomacy and alliances out of an amount of self-interest. Is there any argument that at least there's a certain rugged honesty to the way Trump goes about it?
Well, the problem is this is not just some small nation, say on the coast of Africa or, in the middle of Central America that has some resource we need, and we're going to make a deal with them, and we'll give them technology and aid, and they'll give us, neutronium or whatever it is that we need. This is a country that is fighting a war in the middle of Europe against the biggest invasion since the Nazis marched in 1939. And to me, it's unseemly and unnecessary to shake down our own allies when what we ought to be doing is to ask the Ukrainians, what can we be doing to help you?
I mean, President Trump has signaled a certain interventionist intent in a couple of other contexts. These are, of course, his threats or promises to in some way conquer Canada, Greenland, and Panama. It is a bit of an eternal question where Trump is concerned, but 100 days in, where do we rate his levels of seriousness on those proposals?
The problem is you never know. Trump has made fools of his staff for years by saying something outrageous, and then his people come out and say, well, he was speaking metaphorically, or he didn't really mean it, or he was just kind of off the cuff. And then, of course, the next day Trump says, no, I'm dead serious. And he lets his people get out on a limb, and then he inevitably saws it off behind them. But I think, there was the flush of victory and returning to the White House, and the relief that must have flooded through Trump, realizing that he was not actually going to go to prison, which is where he was headed, led to a kind of megalomania to say, yeah, we're going to get Greenland. I mean, look, I wrote a piece for The Atlantic about a month ago where I said, take him seriously about Greenland. When a president stands in front of Congress and says, I will do this, well, here in America, we call that policy. When the president says it in an official venue, it's policy. Now, does he really mean to do it? Are there people around him who are really dedicated to getting this done? I doubt it. But the fact that he even says it out loud, and that we have to take him seriously because he is the president, and when he talks, we must actually hear the things he says, tells you what a parlous situation we're in with our friends and allies. We are shaking down the Ukrainians. We are threatening the Danes. We are insulting and trying to humiliate the Canadians, who clearly, as their last election showed, are having none of it. In a way, it's almost I don't mean it to sound this way, Andrew, but it's almost an irrelevant question about whether he's serious. He said it out loud, and now we all have to live with, the fallout from that.
Well, on that thought, I guess, we are 100 days in. We therefore have almost 4 more years of this to go, perhaps 8 more years, or 12 or 16, if Trump himself is to be believed when he talks in official capacity on that subject. But is it actually possible in today's world that the United States could construct any sort of useful network of alliances rather, that is based purely on transaction, i.e. what each party can get out of it? Or does there need to be some sort of shared commingled values anchoring it somewhere?
I taught international relations for years, and I always tried to get my students to understand the difference between an ally and a client. And what you're talking about, these purely transactional relationships of convenience, we have a term for that. Those are client states. Those are states that say, ignore our ugly system of government and we will buy all our weapons from you. The United States had relationships like that during the Cold War, where for the sake of the big chess game that we were playing with the Soviet Union, that we got cozy with a lot of people that we shouldn't have. We've also had, purely functional economic relations with countries that we're not very interested in terms of, shared values. But we simply, again, we say, well, we'll buy your bananas, you buy our cars, and everything's Jake. I don't believe that you can lead the world that way. I think the thing that has always made me proudest as an American is that even when we've done these terrible things, even when we've had some pretty shaky allies or clients that we shouldn't have cozied up to, our alliances are based on shared values. Our closeness to Canada, to the UK, to other nations around the world has been built on our shared sense that the right world to live in is a world where democracy is valued, where the rules of the international system are made consensually for the good of the countries around the world, rather than the new world we're moving to, where the rules are going to be set in Moscow or Beijing and will be to the advantage of the autocrats and their cronies. And so I don't think it is sustainable to create that a world based on transactionalism. That didn't even work back, in the heyday of mercantilism, 400 years ago. That that just led to wars and imperial land grabs and fights over resources. And I think 80 years of global peace. And when I know people don't think of it that way, but we have not had a world war, and certainly not a nuclear war, since World War II. That's an achievement that I think is threatened by this kind of purely transactional approach to international relations.
Tom Nichols, staff writer with The Atlantic, thank you for joining us. That's it for this episode of The Foreign Desk. We'll be back next week, and look out for The Foreign Desk Explainer, available every Wednesday. The Foreign Desk was produced by Anita Riota and Lily Austin. Lily also produces The Foreign Desk Explainer. To contact the Foreign Desk team, you can email Anita at aer@monocle.com. And don't forget to subscribe to Monocle Magazine and our free daily email bulletins by heading to our website at monocle.com. From me, Andrew Muller, thanks very much for listening. Until next time, goodbye.